In previous modules, we've talked about your web browser and what its job is to display a web page, and not just display it, but to display it in a stylized manner that is visually appealing to the end user. Now, we've created a basic template and it works, but it's a little on the boring side, to be honest. It's because all we're using is the default styles. So in this module, we want to take a look at how can I apply some basic styles to start creating a visual design. Nothing elaborate or extreme, that's going to be for later, but something that's simple, even easy enough that a non-design person, a technical person, can follow through. So let's take a look, and the first thing we need to ask ourselves is, where are we going to place our styles? In previous forms of HTML, there were 3 acceptable places. However, in HTML5 with CSS3, there are only 2. So we're only going to look at those 2. The first is inside of a style tag. And if you remember when we talked about the head tag, we said that a lot of times what we place up in the head tag, while it's not visible, it controls the body. It controls how we visualize it. And so our style tag should, it's not required to, but should go inside of our head. And it's simple. It's just style. It has an open and closing tag. And inside this, we can make our CSS selectors and rules. Now, we'll talk about what those selectors and rules are in a little bit. Let's first talk about why we might put something in a style tag. Well, if I have something that is unique to this web page. So for example, I don't have a search form up on the website header. I have a separate form on a separate page, and that's the only place that does it. Well, I might want to put my styles that relate to my form simply there. Just something simple and easy that's going to be specific to that page. I don't want to put something like on a template page that's going to be used over and over and over again, because that's going to be very repetitive. I want things that are specific to that page. Now, let's say I have a series of pages that need to be styled all the same way, and I'm going to be sharing those styles. Well, then I want to put that into an external file that I link in. And the reason why is it's going to make my website faster. You see, the browser's going to go and it's going to download that CSS style sheet, and then it gets to the next page. It's going to go, oh, wait a second, I've already got that. Your browser stores things that it's recently used in what they call cache. And cache is just a little temporary place that can hold information so that when you go back to a page or you go to another page on a website, it goes, oh, I've got that logo, I've got that style sheet, I got that JavaScript file, I've got whatever already here. You don't have to go out and download it again. So that first page is a little slow to download, but hopefully every other page is much faster. So in order to do a style, I'm going to change this tag and say link. I'm going to do rel. This defines the relationship of this link to the external file, and it's going to be a style sheet. I'm then going to use the href tag. Href is a hyperlink reference. That's what it's short for. It's a URL to my source. And so a lot of times I'll call this styles.css. Not always. You can name anything you want. You just have to make sure it's named correctly, including capitalization. Remember, most web servers are case sensitive. Then finally, I'm going to have an attribute called type, and this is going to be text/CSS. Notice that there is no closing link tag. Notice I have both a style tag and the link tag. Can I do this? Yes, I can. I can actually have both of those. So I can have an external file that goes in and shows me most of the things I'm going to use. And then I'm going to have a separate style tag for the things that might be unique to that page. Now, hopefully, I don't have a lot of unique things on a page. Hopefully. But this is a way of doing it. All right, so I'm going to save this real quick and I'm going to create a style sheet. So I'm going to come over to File, say New File. It's going to be a text file. Select my language. You'll notice that CSS is already in that list. And you go, well, that was pretty boring. There's nothing here. Well, yes, but a CSS file is a plain text file. So let's look at how we're going to create things. So I'm going to save this real quick. Styles.css. And now I'm ready to go. Now, you might say, well, how am I ready? What am I going to do with this? Well, I need to start defining my styles. And to define my styles, I need to define first a selector. So what is a selector? Well, going back to my template.html, I can see my web page. And if I look at my tags, I want to be able to select this tag. Well, how do I do that? That's the selector. The easiest way is to simply specify the tag name. So in my styles.css, you'll notice I have both these files open. They're in separate tabs. That's fine. I usually do this. In fact, I might have 3 or 4 files open at one time working on them. But if I want to use the header, I can simply type in header. And this is going to find anywhere that header tag exists, and then it's going to allow us to control it. Header is my selector. You'll notice it's got a little underline here, and if I look at this, it says, hey, you have an empty rule set. The rule set is what's inside of those curly braces. And it's just saying you don't have any rules in here to define it. You've selected it, but you don't do anything with it. Do you know what you're doing? Yeah, give us time to write, okay? So let's go in and give it a rule. Okay, so a rule set's going to be a selection or collection of rules. And we can do things like background color. So I can change the background color. And you'll notice it comes up and it has a series of predefined words that I can use. Visual Studio is nice enough to list those for me. It also lists what's known as the hexadecimal color. So the hexadecimal color is how a lot of us old timers do it. That's all we used to have. You'll notice it's in pairs. So there's actually 3 pairs. Run 0 through F. Hexadecimal is a 16-base numbering system, if you're not familiar with it. So they run from 0 through F, so you can be 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, which is black. That shows none of the red, blue, or green, because that's the 3 pairs that you have. All the way up to FF, 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 which is pure white. So no red, no green, no blue is black. All red, all green, all blue is white. And you can mix and match those colors in between. You've got literally millions of variations with those 6 characters. So let's say I want something that's not quite black, but still pretty dark, like a really dark gray. I could come in and say pound. Anytime I'm going to use a hexadecimal color, I have to start off with a pound symbol. And I might say 333. There's 2 things I want you to notice right away. There's a little box that comes up and you see the color here. And if you hover over it, you get a little screen that's going to come up and it's going to show you it. You go, okay, that's new. Well, that's something that Visual Studio Code does for us. This is not in the CSS document. This is purely Visual Studio Code. If you're using a different editor, you may not get that. Okay, so that's the first thing I want to point out. The second thing you might say is, well, wait a second. I thought you said it was 6 characters. 3 sets of 2, but I only see 3 characters there. Well, if all 3 sets, the values in each of the sets are the same, then it will let you only have to put in 1. It's a shortcut. Remember I said programmers tend to be really efficient. Not having to write 3 extra characters, that's considered efficient for us. They don't have to be the same character for all. So I could have done 3, 4, 5, and if you look at that, you'll notice it's a more of a blue-gray. Okay, so right now text by default is black, and so black on a dark blue-gray is not going to show up. So you might think, well, maybe I should change the color. That's a great idea. So we're going to have color, and then I'm going to go ahead and set this to white. And I'll use white instead of doing pound FFF just to show you how well it works. Notice that Visual Studio Code still puts a little box next to it. Even though you defined it as white, it puts it there so you can see it. So this is a really simple example, but what it shows you is we have our selector, in this case header. we have a rule set. That's those curly braces, and there's rules inside of them. Now, each rule is made up of two parts that you'll see. Those two parts is the property and the value. On the left is always a property, and you'll notice that Visual Studio Code colors that for us. Remember, any coloring it does just is to make it easier for us, the developers, to read it. The property is separated by a colon, and then we have our value. In this case, we've just done colors. There's lots of different properties, and colors is not always an appropriate thing. So if I come down here, you'll notice if I type S, you'll notice that Visual Studio Code brings up a whole list of possible properties we can set that start with the letter S. If I type in W, you see a whole different set of properties that start with W. And you can do this with almost any letter. It doesn't matter. So we're going to look at some other properties in just a minute. Let's take a look real quick and see what has this done for our template. So I'm back here. I'm going to reload this. So you can see, hey, I've got that background. I've changed the color of my header. I like that, but I still have some issues, okay? You know, I really want my header to stand out a little bit more, be a little taller, a little bit bigger, things like that. So let's see what I can do. All right. I'm going to come in here. I'm going to talk about sizing real quick. And there's a couple of things about sizing I need to know. Every element has what they call the CSS box model assigned to it. Now, we can completely control this box model. The box model says how much space is between me and other elements, how much space is between my inner content and the edge of my element and the borders. It's going to control how big I'm going to display. Am I displaying the full width of my screen or just a small little part? And remember, I talked about your tags can be considered block or inline. There's some subsets of those. The block and inline is the two big groups. I could even control that and change it if I want to. So for example, I might come in here and say, well, I want to make sure there's no spacing above or to the sides of my box. Okay, I want to make sure I'm up all the way at the top. So I'm going to specify margin, and I'm going to set it to be 0. Now margin 0 says there's no space in between it on any side. When I only have a single value, it is showing all four sides. If I want to control the top and bottom, left and right separately, I can give two values, top and bottom, and then my left and right. If I want to control all four, I can say top, and then I read it like a clock. I go clockwise, top, right. Let's say I want to give some space at the bottom, so I'm going to say 20. Okay, so you might be asking, well, 20 what? You see, a value of 0 is 0. It doesn't matter what unit of measurement you have. 0 inches is the exact same size as 0 miles, or 0 meters, or 0 micrometers. But when you get to a value, that changes. And CSS is very specific. It says, well, if you're going to give me a value, you've got to give me a unit of measurement. Now, there's different types of unit of measurement. I'm just going to use px here. Px is short for pixels, so I want 20 pixels. So my top is 0, right is 0, bottom is 20 pixels. Let's move things down. And then my left side is 0. Okay, that makes sense. That's easy. My padding is going to be from my content section to my border of my, so that's going to be inside. This lets me expand the space of my background. So I'm going to put in here padding, and instead of saying auto, I'm going to say 10 pixels. I find that I'm going to try a little bit, and then I almost always go back and say, well, let me see how this works, or maybe I need a little bit more, a little bit less. A lot of times trying to get this sizing to work is a little bit like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. This one's too much, this one's not enough. This is the amount that I need to use. I tried 20, I tried 10, nope. Hey, you know what? 15 was perfect. And so you have to kind of try things out to see how they're going to work. So I'm going to come in here. So I'm going to come here, switch over to my browser. You can see how this has changed. I now have a little bit more padding, the top and bottom. My website is now moved in a little bit because it's got the padding. there's not a lot of space around the outside edge. And so let me show you how we're going to fix that. Because remember, we were hoping to have that content, kind of be pushed off right to the edge. So I'm going to use a new selector. Which one? Well, I'm going to do body. You might say body. That's right, the body tag. It's a tag, I can select it. And so I'm going to choose margin 0 and padding to be 0 as well. Now notice that if I reload this, there's no more border around the edge. Okay. Now the downside is you'll notice that my text is fully up against that far left hand side. Probably going to want to change that. We'll get to how we're going to do that in just a little bit. But now I can have things that move all the way off to the side. The next thing I want to do is I want to change the size of my website, that text. I want that text to be bigger. And our first inclination might be to say, oh, I've got the H1 tag. Well, the H1 tag, remember, you need to think of it kind of like that outline in the English class. Is this something that's going to define the whole web page? Kind of, but is there a better option? Yeah, there probably is. So let's see how we can change this. If I go back to my template, you'll notice that, oh, I have a paragraph tag. So my first inclination might be to say, okay, I'm going to use the paragraph tag, and there is a property called font size. And I'm going to simply change the font size. I'm going to make it, 30 pixels. If I do this, save it, go back to my template, reload, notice this works. However, this does have a small problem. You said for the paragraph tag. Well, what happens if you have other paragraph tags? That could be a problem. So let's see how we can fix this. Well, there's two different ways that we can fix it. Notice that I'm talking about my paragraph tag that's inside of my header. So I could come in here and say header space P. So now I have my header. Inside my header, I have a tag called paragraph, and now I'm going to control its size. This is known as a compound selector. It also is a more specific selector, so if I have a paragraph that's not inside my header, it's ignored. And this might work really well in some cases. However, I might have additional paragraphs inside of my header. Because I might have a paragraph for my site title, then maybe I have a little catch line or something like that. A slogan or catchphrase or something like that that might be in there. I don't want that to be the same size as my site title. So how am I going to do this? Now let me go back to my template. Here's my header. Here's my paragraph tag. Remember, I could have more than one paragraph tag. So I wanted to find a way to control just that one tag. An easy way to do this is with a class. Classes were specifically designed to allow us to apply CSS to just the tag that has that class. Now, there may be more than one tag with that class, and that's okay. But we can also create classes that are only going to be used once. And we do this so we can define it. There's another option called an ID. We can use that attribute, but it's not really designed for using CSS. That's what the classes is for. IDs are more designed for doing interaction with JavaScript. So we want to use the right attribute for the right purpose. So I'm going to be inside my paragraph tag. I'm going to say class. I'm going to call this site-title. I'm going to change my selector. Instead of saying header.p, I'm going to say dot. All my class names in CSS start with a dot. Notice that my tags don't have any prefix, but my classes start with a dot. I'm going to say site-title. If I come back here, reload it, notice it's exactly the same. That's what I want to see. I can make other changes. So for example, I might say font-weight, and you notice it gives a list of values. I'm going to choose bold. And I reload that. You'll notice that it made that font just a little bit bolder. I can do other things, of course. This is just a quick example of what I'm doing. Now, I personally like to organize my information. You'll notice I have header, I've got body, I got site title, which is inside of header. things are starting to get spread out and it's a little bit harder to organize. So let me give you a little tip on organizing your information. I'm going to move body. I'm just going to cut it using Control X and paste it up at the top. And then I'm going to have my header information. So I'm going to put a CSS comment. A CSS comment will look real familiar if you're used to programming in C or Java. It's a multi-line comment. They do not have the single line comment, so you have to use this one. It's a slash with a star. Whatever's in your comment, that's ignored, and then a star and a slash. The star is just the asterisk shift 8. This lets me know, hey, this is where my rules are going to be, which is nice because I'm going to come down here and say, okay, I want to create rules for my footer, and I can do that. So I'm going to specify footer. I got my declaration of my rule set, and now I'm going to define my rules. I'm going to keep this very simple, okay? My footer, I want to have it so it stands out, but it's not as prominent. So I'm going to once again choose a background color. I'm going to choose a very light gray, okay? I want it to stand out, not a lot, just a little bit. So I'm going to say pound, and then normally your background color for your page is white, FFF. I'm going to choose DDD. Okay, if you look at it, you'll notice, well, it's pretty light. Yeah, I want it to be different, but not stand out too much. A lot of times your footers are things that have to be there. It's not like I want people to go looking for my footer. I'm going to make my font size just a little bit smaller. Well, how big is my other font? By default, in case you're curious, it's 16 pixels. So I can specify pixels. I can also specify a different unit of measurement. And so I'm going to choose 80%. Okay, so now it's just a little bit smaller. Once again, not a lot smaller, just a little bit. And finally, I might say, you know what? Maybe I want to put a border around it, just at the bottom. Okay, so I'm going to say border dash, and I'm going to do top. Now I can put a border around every edge, or I can maybe put it just in one direction. Since my footer's at the bottom, maybe I want that border just on the top so it separates out from the content of the rest of the page. Now when I specify a border, I actually have to specify 3 separate properties. And I can say this as 3 separate rules, or I can combine them. The 3 separate things I have to specify are a color, a style, and a size. So I'm going to specify black, solid, and then just 1 pixel. Okay. Once again, I want to be separated, but not stand out too much. I'm also going to specify a little bit of spacing between the bottom of my content and my margin. This is going to enforce it. So I'm going to say margin, and I'm going to say margin dash top. Remember, I could, like I did the other place, say 0000, and maybe just put the value into one place, but this gives me a different way of doing it. So I'm going to say margin top 20 pixels. If I reload, you notice my text is just a little bit smaller. I have a light gray background and that border that goes across the top of it. Notice it only goes across the top. Now I could go and say, you know what? That black is too stark. Maybe I'm going to make it a little bit less so it's not as intense. Or maybe that background color is too dark. I'm going to make it a little bit lighter. I can go in there once again and tweak. I'm not set in stone. I can always make little tweaks. So that's just a couple examples. So we saw how to do selectors with tags. We saw how to do selectors with classes. We saw how to do things like change the foreground and background color, change the font size, change the margin and padding. So when we talk about sizing, remember I said that we have to use units. Now if it's a 0, we don't have to give a unit because it doesn't matter what size unit it is, 0 is always 0. But if we give it a value, we need to specify a unit. So here's the units that CSS gives us. You'll notice that some of them are a little bit different than what you might expect. For example, inches. Well, if I use inches, that's a real problem for me because what happens if I'm designing this to be used like on a cell phone or on a tablet? or on a jumbo screen. An inch is physical representation. It should be the same, but our browser is going to go, wait a second, I need to try to figure this out. This is going to be the same also for other physical units of measurement like centimeters and meters. Even things that you might not think about like points and picas. So you might be going, well, wait a second, why does this exist if it's going to be different on all the different types of screens? Well, CSS was not designed just to be displayed on display screens, such as your computer or your phone, but also on other places, such as books or other things like that. And so therefore, it has physical unit sizes so that if you were laying out a page in a book, you could do that. In fact, I personally have created a web page that had two different style sheets. One that was designed for if we need to print it out, and one if we were looking at it on a screen. I had a customer, they had an order form, and they needed to print them out for their files for tax purposes so they can bring them to their accountant. And so I created a printout that printed it out and looked appropriately on an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. It didn't have things like menus and those types of things. It looked like it was designed to be printed out. That meant I was using things like inches to figure out where my borders and things were. However, when they pulled it up on their web page, it had things like the menu. It had things that were expressed in pixels because a pixel is a unit of measurement that's appropriate for a digital display. You can also find things such as M, which is a relationship of the capital letter M, X, which is EX, which is equal to the X height of your current font, and percentages. Your pixels, M's, X's, and percent is what you should be using for web pages that are going to be displayed in a browser. There's also a REM, relational EM, which is based upon a base unit measurement. And that's because your proportional fonts are kind of cumulative. So I might go bigger and smaller and bigger and smaller, and try to figure that out. It's a little bit harder. Your REM goes all the way back to the base unit size. Says, okay, based off of that, what am I going to use? So that's another one that you might see. Now, I do also want to show you your margins and padding. The easiest way is actually in a web page. We've talked about this a little bit. We see some basic examples. Let's go in here. I'm going to change my footer to display a margin of 20 pixels. And I'm going to display a padding also of 20 pixels. Go back and reload it in my screen, and you can see the difference here. Now you might think, okay, what is the margin? What is the padding? What is my border? Those types of things. Well, the easiest way to do this is to kind of dig into it. And luckily, most modern browsers allow you to do this very easily. If I right-click on my web page, I can choose Inspect. Now in Chrome, it's all at the bottom for me. If you're using a different browser, it might be a different location for you. But you'll notice it comes up and shows my web page. It has my elements, my console, and then off to my side, I see here my rules. Okay, so if I select footer, you'll notice that when I select it, I have three different colors. I have kind of this orangey color, a green color, and a blue-gray color. Well, the blue-gray color is my content area. This is where my content's going to display. This content can be an image, it could be text, it could be a video, it could be a combination of things. Whatever my content is, that's displayed. I then have that green bar, and that green bar is my padding. My padding says how far from my content to the edge of where my border is. Might go, your border? Well, yes, if you look across the top, you'll notice you have that single line border. My border could go on all sides, and whether I actually have a border display or not, my padding goes up to that place. I then have my border, and then finally in that orangey area, tan area if you would, is my margin. And my margin is separation between other elements. I can come over here to my styles section, and I can change it to see what it looks like. So if I want to see what 50 pixels looks like, you'll notice that 50 pixels pushes the content inward. Okay, I have a bigger background area. You'll notice that the background color stayed exactly the same place when I changed my padding. That's because my background color or image, and we haven't talked about background images yet, but whether I use a background color or an image displays out to my border. So when I move my padding and increase its size or decrease its size, I'm going to see more or less of that color or image. Now, my margin is a different story. I'm going to go back to 20 pixels for my padding, and I'm going to choose my margin. And now my margin, I'm going to set to 80. Notice that while my content moved further in and away, so did my border, so did my space around it. That's because it's the separation between it and other elements. Okay, so I want to keep this in mind. Your browser has a simple built-in way for me to go and start making these little changes. I can make other changes with it. I can add properties. I can do weapons if I want a top margin of 80, but I want 0 for all my other sizes. I can see what that's going to look like. Okay, I can come in and set other properties. So come in here, and now I can type in something else. So I might choose to say font weight, bold. You can notice it makes a change there. This does not save those values. So I can go in, I can make these changes, but I will need to take this and go back into Visual Studio Code, write down all my changes. Otherwise, when I reload, you notice it's back to what it was. Okay? So these are just temporary changes, but they allow you to kind of test some ideas, let you see things. Understanding that box model is very important. Remember, margins on the outside, separation between your two elements, your border, your padding, and then your content. Now, margin is a little unique. I'm going to leave you with this. Margin is a little unique. That's because your margin can be 0, but it's also the only element in the sizing that can be a negative value. You might think a negative value. That's right, a negative value. I can bring my content in closer. Okay? So the way the margin works is I have two elements. I have two different margins. A margin bottom for my top. That says how much separation between that and the next element. And on the element below it, I have a margin top, and that's going to be the space. So let's say I have 40 pixels for both. How much space is here? Well, 40 pixels. You might go, well, wait a second, shouldn't it be 40 plus 40? It'd be 80. It's not the way it works. Is what it does is it looks and says, what's the biggest number? So if I have 0 and 40, it's 40 pixels. If I have 40 and 40, it's 40 pixels. If I have 10 and 40, it's 40 pixels because 40 is the biggest number. Now, if I use a negative number, I kind of undo that. So let's say my top element, my bottom margin is -10. My bottom is showing a top margin of 40. Well, then it adds the two. -10 plus 40 is 30, and so it brings it up a little bit. And so I can do this on purpose to bring elements closer if I use a negative value. Negative values do not work with your sizing. They do not work with your content area or padding. Only margins. Margins is kind of a unique case, but it gives you a lot more flexibility you wouldn't otherwise have. So keep that in mind when you're working in your sizing. Now, we've looked at changing things like your font size, your font weight, your color, your background color, your margin, your padding, your border. There's tons and tons and tons of properties. You can go through the book and find other examples of properties. We've listed the most common ones, not all of them, just the most common, and you can start playing with them. In some cases, you'll need to use multiple properties together to be effective. That's fine too. But for now, this should get you started. Remember, this isn't really a design course. This is designed more for technical people. And so we're working on what works well in this area. With that, we'll let you go until the next module.